Oliver. Thank you very, very much. I'm good. I am delighted to be here. I appreciate you introducing me. Steve, I appreciate you being here. Lieutenant Governor, I appreciate your being here. I want to ask you a couple of questions just as a benchmark to where we are. How many of you believe that the United States very badly needs a fundamental change in direction? This is very important, okay? Because I want you to think about the logic. I'm going to explain why I'm running. But I want you to think about the logic of this, okay? How many of you think that getting that fundamental change actually through to genuinely change Washington will be a real fight? Yeah. Okay, well, here's why. This is why I decided to run. There are three components to what we're trying to accomplish. You need somebody who can explain what we believe well enough that 70 or 80% of the American people decide we're right. Because after the elite media gets done with these, you need to slide from 70 to 60, not from 55 to 40. And that person has to be a good enough debater to be able in October of next year to stand on the same platform with President Obama and actually win the debate. Because in the end, people are going to look in and say, okay, because the critique I'm offering is a very bold, very real critique. And so they got to decide who's right, who's telling the truth. Which reality is the one we want? Second, that person has to be able to actually drive things through Washington to actually get them done. We don't just want a great campaign. And we don't just want to beat the president. We want to actually accomplish positive things in a positive way that gets this country back on track. It's a much higher standard. And finally, you need somebody who actually has very large solutions because we currently have very large problems. Now, I honestly believe that there are very few people who fit those three characteristics. And as Calista and I talked about it for over a year, I just concluded, my dad was a career soldier for 27 years in the infantry, I just concluded that I had a duty to come back out, knowing how tough it would be, knowing how often we get attacked, and say, you know, I want to have a conversation with the American people. I want to tell what I understand to be the truth. I want to lay out in that conversation where I think we need to go. I want to listen to the American people and learn from them for a year and a half. And I want together not to put one person in the Oval Office who's going to perform miracles. I want to recruit millions of citizens who want to actually help make it work. And there are two reasons for that. The first is, if we win the election, we're going to have to then convince the Congress to do what needs to be done. Well, if we don't have thousands and thousands of citizens in every congressional district, we won't have enough pressure to get it done. Second, if we implement a 10th Amendment Enforcement Act, and we really successfully take a lot of power out of Washington, and we send it back home, you actually have to be a bigger, more active citizen. Because we just took a lot of the power away from the bureaucrats, and we returned it to the citizens. So it actually requires a more active citizenry to be able to solve the local problems. Remember, there are 513,000 elected officials in the United States. There are only 537 in Washington. All the rest are state and local officials. And beyond them, you've got volunteer organizations. For example, Rotary International has played a huge role in polio eradication. I mean, different groups do different things. America is a country of an enormous amount of volunteerism. And the more we take power out of Washington, the more we're going to need that citizen activity at home. So that's the core of the campaign. Now, I want to ask you one more set of sort of showing your hands. Many of you have probably heard that Speaker Pelosi's district got an unusually high percentage of waivers from Obamacare. And somebody pointed out that apparently Senator Reid has gotten waivers for the entire state of Nevada. And my question is this. I'm really curious. Have any of you gotten waivers? I got one for my wife. Got one for your wife, okay. For Obamacare? Don't want it. So, how many of you would agree that if select interest groups in San Francisco get a waiver, fairness requires that every American should have a waiver, so we're all being treated equal? How many of you would agree with that? Okay, let's think of it. So my question is this. why don't we pass a bill that says everybody gets a waiver to 2014? Because this forces the president, how's the president going to explain, no, you're not allowed to have one, but those folks get one? And it's fundamentally unfair, and it raises all sorts of questions about corruption. Well, you have two restaurants down the street, and one gets a waiver, one doesn't. How can that be fair? How can that make sense? And so one of the things I'm going to advocate is there's a bill actually in Congress right now with Mike Rogers of Michigan that would provide for every American to be able to get a waiver. And so I'm going to urge the Republicans in the House to put that bill in the debt ceiling, so that in order for the president to get the debt ceiling he says he needs so bad, he has to let everybody have the same waiver San Francisco's getting, in which case we won't implement Obamacare until after we get done winning the election, in which case we'll repeal Obamacare before we implement it. And it strikes me that that's the right direction. I think the greatest challenge we face is jobs in the economy. And I think people underestimate how big a challenge this is. 27% of the homes in the United States are worth less than their mortgage. Now, the only way you solve that is by having so much economic growth that people's incomes go up, that they can afford to buy a house and pay more for a house. You don't get the general economy fixed, you're not going to fix the home mortgage problem. There's no gimmick in Washington that can solve it. So how do you create jobs? Well, I worked with Jack Kemp and Ronald Reagan in the late 70s and early 80s. We had a very clear plan. Ronald Reagan's plan for the economy was cut taxes, cut regulations, and make people who create jobs, entrepreneurs, small businessmen, make them proud of what they're doing, so they have energy and confidence and they go out and do it. That very clear program led to 25 years of economic growth. When it started to slow down in the mid-90s, as Speaker of the House, we reformed welfare, which was the largest entitlement reform in your lifetime. 2 out of 3 people in welfare went back to work or went to school. We controlled spending. We had the first tax cut in 16 years, including the largest capital gains tax cut in history. The result was unemployment went from 5.6% when I became Speaker to slightly under 4% a little bit after when I left the speakership. Now, when you take those people and you take them off of unemployment, off of food stamps, off of welfare, off of Medicaid, and you put them over here working, taking care of their family, and paying taxes, you are reducing government spending and you're increasing government revenues. It was a very big factor in why we were able to balance the budget for 4 straight years and pay off $405 billion in debt. So, if you take that model, I would argue the #1 goal should be to get Americans back to work as the best single first step you can take towards balancing the budget. If you control spending while getting Americans back to work, you really start to change the whole pattern. And remember, we now have 9% unemployment and approximately 15% underemployment, people who are no longer looking for work. So you really have a huge pool of people that can go back to work to get back down to a 4% unemployment rate. And that would be an enormous change both in government spending, and it would be an enormous change in terms of revenue for the government from people who have jobs. Last year we spent $140 billion on unemployment compensation. There's still one item. Now imagine we're back down to 4%. How much that would change. So, in that context, I think you have to have 5 major tax changes as a starting point. The first one is we really need to freeze the current tax code and have no tax increase in 2013 because raising taxes in the middle of a recession is destructive. The second thing we should do is recognize there really is a world market. People tell us this all the time. Well, there's also a world market in capital. So there's money sitting all over the planet looking for a place to be invested. And it wants to go someplace to make money. If we were to go to 0 capital gains, have no capital gains tax, the amount of capital that would flow into the United States to open factories, to create jobs, to start new companies would be breathtaking. And you'd overnight have an explosion of new opportunity. The third change is pretty straightforward. It will apply both to farming and to factories. And that is, you should be able to write off any new equipment with 100% expenses, which means you could write it off in 1 year. And the goal would be to have American workers have the best equipment in the world, the newest equipment in the world, the most productive equipment in the world. It's important to remember, Germany pays 50% more for manufacturing labor, and they have the lowest unemployment rate they've had in 19 years. The reason is they have a government which wants them to constantly modernize, is constantly retraining the workforce, and they have a government which goes out and tries to export things. Now compare that with President Obama, who went to Brazil and said to the Brazilians, I'm really glad you're drilling offshore. And I'm really glad we could guarantee $2 billion in equipment for a company George Soros was investing in. And then he went on to say, and I want us to be your best customer. That struck me as exactly backwards. And you can't have a policy that says, let's borrow from the Chinese to pay the Brazilians. I mean, that's not, I mean, your 16-year-old would understand that's not sustainable. What you have to have is a policy that focuses on America. And so I would look at how do we constantly modernize our equipment so we have the best workforce in the world with the best equipment in the world. So, and then have a U.S. government which is constantly focused on exports and constantly applies pressure to get doors open so that we can sell American goods on a worldwide basis, and doesn't allow one-sided trade deals where they somehow cleverly stop us, but we're supposed to buy from them. The fourth thing I would do on taxes is I would reduce what is now the highest corporate tax rate in the world, 35%. I would reduce it to the Irish tax rate of 12.5%. And what's really amazing is, at 35%, we get virtually nothing from General Electric. The reason is, at 35%, it is profitable for General Electric to hire 375 lawyers who do nothing all day, every day, but figure out every possible tax loophole. At 12.5%, they would fire about half the lawyers and actually pay their taxes, because it actually would be cheaper just to fill out the form and send the tax money. So I think we would actually get more revenue at 12.5%, while the companies would quit playing games, focus on economic growth, compete in the world market. And if we were only paying 12.5%, our companies could compete virtually everywhere with companies that currently pay much lower rates. The last thing I think we should do on taxes is I think we have an absolute obligation to eliminate permanently the death tax. It is the most destructive tax we have culturally, because it says to people, if you work all your life, you do the right things your whole life, you're frugal, you save, you invest, when you die, some politician's going to reach into your wallet and take half the money. And that's just profoundly wrong. No one should be forced to go to the undertaker and the IRS the same week. So I'm for permanently abolishing death tax. I believe that tax policy starts the process of real economic growth. The second leg of what Ronald Reagan did was deregulation. And I'll give you 3 examples. We should repeal Sarbanes-Oxley, which is a very complicated bill that accomplishes nothing good, produces no new information, but adds billions of dollars of cost to American business. We just repeal it. It was a mistake. Second, the Environmental Protection Agency has evolved over time into being anti-business, anti-jobs, anti-local control, imposing a radical agenda through bureaucratic fiat. I don't think it's fixable. I think the folks who've now been hired by EPA really believe in what they're doing. They really don't want to see a free enterprise America, and they really don't trust local people. And so my answer is we should replace the Environmental Protection Agency with a brand new Environmental Solutions Agency. The Environmental Solutions Agency should use science and technology, should use incentives and entrepreneurs and innovators, and should be dedicated to collaborating and cooperating with local government or state government to apply common sense to get to the best solutions at the lowest cost so that we can have both a sound environment and a sound economy. And I think replacing EPA with an Environmental Solutions Agency will do as much to change the future as any single thing we could do, because the EPA has become a really destructive agency. Finally, on the regulatory front, I think that we can have longer lives with greater independence, at lower cost, with more American jobs, if we create a 21st century Food and Drug Administration. The FDA should be in the scientific laboratory, understanding and cooperating and collaborating, and trying to figure out how do we take this brand new breakthrough and move it over here to the patient as rapidly as possible. Now, to show you how much the world has changed, and the example I use for the real way to bring down health costs is the iron lung. The iron lung was used for people with polio. In 1950, there were 60,000 Americans who came down with polio. If you had done a projection in 1960 of how many people in 2011 will be in an iron lung maintained by the government in a very expensive facility, but a pretty big number. There are none today. The reason is, in 1951, Jonas Salk discovered the polio vaccine. In an act of courage, in 1952, he vaccinated his own family. In 1953, over 1 million people were vaccinated in a mass experiment. And within a few years, we basically wiped polio out in the U.S., and with Rotary International's help, they've almost wiped it out worldwide. The step from initial test to 1 million people in the current Food and Drug Administration would have probably taken 20 to 25 years. Because it's now so regulatory, so hostile, so unwilling to learn new science. So we need a very substantially modernized Food and Drug Administration if we're going to be successful. So the last thing we need on economic growth, we need an American energy policy. It makes no sense for the United States to ship $400 or $500 billion a year outside the country. It's both bad for our economy and it's bad for national security. I mean, I wish the President in his Middle Eastern speech today had talked a little bit about why we need to have energy security here so we quit sending money to people who want to kill us. And I think it's really foolish for us to not find a way to build a dramatic increase in energy. Despite all the efforts of government to oppose the oil industry, we are still the third largest oil producer in the world, after Saudi Arabia and Russia. If the government was actually favoring us, we'd have an extraordinary explosion of new energy sources. So I'm committed to oil and gas, I'm committed to coal, I'm committed to wind, where you now get 15% of your electricity in Iowa. I'm committed across the board to all sorts of energy, and I am committed to ethanol. And I can tell you flatly, this is not something new, this is not something that came up recently. In 1984, I voted for what was then called gasohol, which is the original term. Ronald Reagan signed the bill and supported it. In 1986, I voted to renew it, and the reason was simple. We were trying to move towards American energy independence. In 1998, as Speaker, according to Senator Grassley, I worked with he and with Jim Nussel, and Grassley said I basically saved the ethanol program that year. I did it for a practical reason, and I'm happy to debate anywhere in the country. If I've got to choose between the next $1 billion going to Iran or going to Iowa, I'd rather have it go to Iowa. If I have to choose between the next $1 billion after that going to Saudi Arabia or going to South Dakota, I'd rather it go to South Dakota. And I think that biofuels are the future. And if you look at the current price of producing ethanol, which has gotten dramatically more efficient in the last 30 years, it is actually, right now, about 80 cents a gallon under oil. And so I think that this is an area we want to continue to develop. And I think if you combine the capital gains tax cut with the corporate tax cut, with the 100% expensing, which would also apply to farm equipment, you see a way you could have a program to continuously improve and continuously modernize the industry. It also helps them move towards flex fuel cars and flex pumps, which are the things we need in order to maximize the production of ethanol effectively in this country. Let me say two last things. As the Republican nominee, we will have a contract with America again. We'll probably have 7 bills in the contract. One of the 7 bills will be a 10th Amendment Enforcement Act. That is, I'm going around to all the state legislators, all the governors, mayors, and county commissioners and saying, what is it the federal government's currently doing that you think really under the 10th Amendment ought to be back home? And we're going to put together a very strong bill that creates a real shift of power out of Washington for the first time since 1932. And I think if you want to enforce the American Constitution, it is very important that we return power back. The center of gravity in America should be citizens. Remember, our Declaration of Independence says, we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Now, it's a very important concept. It means that power, this is the only country in human history that says power comes from God to each one of you personally. You're personally sovereign. These three young people up here are personally sovereign. And you loan power to the state. The state does not loan power to you. Now, why does that matter? Because it means in the American model, the center of government should always be the citizen, not the bureaucrat. And so by definition, a Washington-dominated system is wrong. By definition, power ought to reside with the citizens. The federal government should be as lean, and to some extent, frankly, have a certain sense of humility. It should be the servant of the American people, not the dictator of the American people. Fundamentally different model than the Obama model. Last thing, we're going to have a great project that all of you can participate in if you want to. It is called On the First Day. Now, I want you to imagine that on inaugural day, after the inaugural address, before Callista and I go into the legislative luncheon, we take a 1-hour break. We go into a room in the Capitol with C-SPAN covering it, and we sign somewhere between 50 and 200 executive orders. Now, these are orders that will be on the campaign website by October 1 of next year. So the whole last part of the campaign, everybody in America will know what I'll do if we win. And we'll have it all out in the open. It'll be very clear. I'll give you just a couple examples. The very first executive order will abolish all of the White House czars as of that day. The second executive order will reinstate President Ronald Reagan's Mexico City policy that no American tax money will go to pay for abortions overseas. The third executive order will reinstate President George W. Bush's enforcement of the Conscience Clause, which says that no doctor, no nurse, no pharmacist can be compelled to perform a procedure that is against their religious beliefs. And the fourth executive order, very appropriate for today's speech by the President of the Middle East, the fourth executive order will say to the State Department, every country in the world will be allowed to designate its own capital, and you will be assigned to put the American embassy where the capital is. The only country in the world that does not have the American embassy in its capital is Israel. The only functioning democracy in the Middle East currently has the American embassy in Tel Aviv because our State Department has refused to recognize Israel's right to define its capital as Jerusalem. Now, just think about that. We have dictators who are grotesque, who we allow to tell us where their capital is. We have governments that are totally destructive, who we allow to tell us where their capital is. But somehow we've singled out Israel to say, you're not really worthy of being able to designate your own capital. I authored in 1995 a bill that said that the embassy will be put in Jerusalem unless the President waives the provision. And the State Department has consistently convinced the President to waive it on the grounds that will make somebody unhappy. I think that's a very bad way to run foreign policy. I think the people who will make most unhappy, frankly, are terrorists, and I don't mind if terrorists are unhappy. I'll say one closing thing about foreign policy, and then I'll take questions. I believe we should have an American foreign policy. I believe it should be based on American interests, on the American Constitution, on our sense of how the world works. I think when the President the other night at the National Defense University cited the Arab League in the United Nations 8 times and the U.S. Congress once, it told you everything you needed to know about how wrong his model is. We have a responsibility to carry out the constitutional mandate based on the Declaration of Independence, and we should not give up any of our rights to international treaties. We should not allow clever left-wingers to find ways to manipulate the United Nations or to manipulate the international law in order to change America against our will. And when we look at a region, we ought to look at the region first and foremost from the perspective of what is in America's interest. This doesn't mean I'm an isolationist. My dad was a career soldier. I grew up in France and in Germany. I did my doctoral degree in Belgium. I am fully aware that there's a larger world. But I think I want us to relate to that world by first understanding what America needs, putting together American interest, and then having an honest, direct relationship. And I'll just close this example. We've given Pakistan $20 billion since 9/11, and now we discover that bin Laden wasn't hiding in some cave. He's living in a huge house in the middle of a major military town about a mile away from their National Defense University. Now, do any of you believe he could have been living in that place without the Pakistanis knowing it? And I think they owe us a lot of answers. And I think, frankly, Mr. Panetta, who's been nominated to be Secretary of Defense, owes us a lot of answers. How could the CIA for 9.5 years not have figured out, they always kept saying, oh, he's in some cave in northwest Pakistan. No, he's living pretty well in a place right in the middle of the city. And it's very worrisome to me if our intelligence community in 9.5 years didn't realize what the Pakistanis were doing. I think it's very worrisome about the relative quality of our intelligence rate. So, let me, I'm delighted you all are here. If you decide you want to support me, the number one thing you can do is when you get home, either go to Facebook or Twitter or your email account, and just send out a note to your friends and urge them to go to my first name, newt.org. Our website is just newt.org. We'd love to have their help and their support, and we'd be very grateful for your help and your support. And let me toss it open for questions or comments or whatever. Way in the back. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Speaker, I do commend you for adding this commentary on jobs and economics as challenges. But I would be remiss as an educator at Kemper High School Advanced Placement English if I didn't raise a question to you about education. You know we have slipped in terms of our numbering in terms of America where we should be on the map. We're somewhere around 23, and you know we should be somewhere at the top since we educate the world. What are your thoughts about how can we move our numbers up and become that shining light on education, as well as what are your thoughts on No Child Left Behind in terms of tweaking it or whatever we need to do? Thank you, sir.
That's a very good question. Let me say first of all that I helped organize with President Clinton the Hart-Rudman Commission, which spent 3 years looking at American national security. And when I stepped down as Speaker, he very generously appointed me to it, and I served on the commission. So it's the most comprehensive review of American national security since 1947. We spent 3 years looking out to 2025. We reported in March of 2001. We said the greatest threat to an American city, the greatest threat to the United States, is a weapon of mass destruction in an American city, probably by a terrorist group. But we said, as in terms of your question, the second greatest threat to the United States is the failure to invest in math and science and the failure of education. And we went on to say it is a greater threat than any conceivable conventional war. That's how serious the education problem is. I think that the answer in part is that you have to dramatically shift towards transparency, accountability, the right of parents to have some level of choice, know what's going on in the school, be involved in the school. I personally believe we ought to go through every level of bureaucracy, starting at the Federal Department of Education, and ask of every single job, is this person really more valuable than a teacher? And if they're not, you eliminate all those jobs, you could pour an amazing amount of money out of the current budget into the classroom instead of into red tape. I also believe that the underlying core concept of No Child Left Behind is fundamentally dangerous. Because what it does is, it has so many tests that students are taught to the test. They're not taught to learn. And that's not how you actually learn. But I'll go a step further. I'm very critical of statewide curriculum programs. There's something that says, on Tuesday morning, we will teach X. But what if on Tuesday morning, the kids come in, something has just happened, and they're really excited about it, and you have a chance to really get them reading? But it doesn't happen to be X. Well, you know, the bureaucracy has decided every classroom in the state will, you know, I think this is a bad model. So I'm for very significant variation. I personally like charter schools, and again, it probably depends on the size of the community. Rural areas have a different challenge. I also believe you ought to look at how much you can do with Governor Newt Gingrich just sent me a note. He actually adopted one of my proposals, and they passed it into law, so I'm really excited to see how it works. I've been going around the country saying we need to recenter for young people how important learning is by giving them incentives. What if we said to people, if you graduate a year early, we will give you the cost of your entire 12th year as a scholarship to go either to Vo-Tech school or to college or wherever you need to go. And so you begin to actually have people focus on how fast can I learn? How much can I learn? And you'll be surprised, when I go out and talk to students from high school and college, how many of them will tell you they could have gotten through in 2 or 3 years. That in fact, the pace we currently set isn't strong enough. I'll say 2 last things. I think we need to revisit in every state the laws on discipline because teachers today are intimidated from establishing discipline, and if you don't have discipline in a class, you can't teach. And I think we've gone way overboard in litigation and all these restrictions, and I want to put power back in the hands of the principal and the teacher to establish discipline and protect the student's right to learn and not be in a disruptive environment. And lastly, at the risk of stepping on some toes, particularly the younger people who are up here, American kids are going to have to do more homework. You know, I don't care how smart you think we are. When you're dealing with Chinese and Indian and Korean students who are working really hard and studying really hard, we aren't going to learn enough. We're not going to be competitive. And so I think we have to set high standards, establish discipline. We have to hire good teachers. I would pay good teachers more. I would clearly recognize merit pay. I mean, every other part of American society, we have merit. Imagine you tried to pull together a football team or a baseball team and said, no, we're going to pay everybody even. It wouldn't work. And so I think we really got to look at what are the things that work in America? Let's apply them to education. But it's a big question because, frankly, education is the heart of our survival. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Mary Bruner, and you and I probably don't agree on very many of the issues, but that's why I'm here. I've come to educate myself. The one issue that I would like to ask you about, you know, I think it's a nice buzzword to say I want to repeal Obamacare. Obamacare is very personal to me. I have a personal situation, a young graduate who has a pre-existing health condition. He's now covered under my insurance. Well, he does a 4-month internship at Camp Dodge this summer with no benefits. Tell me what you'd offer him.
Well, I think we could look at whether or not to extend the 26-year provision, and I'm willing to look at that. It's actually not very expensive. What I'm not willing to do is allow the legislative staffs to pick and choose which parts of Obamacare they repeal. So if that's one of the things we ought to keep, I would say, great, let's write that bill, have it available the morning after we repeal Obamacare, and go through a series of replacing things. But if we open up Obamacare and we start picking and choosing, it'll be a total mess. And I just think that the things I like in it, I'm for information technology. I think it's really important. I'm for preventive care. I think it's really important. I would support passing the bills that kept the good parts, but I'd rather reinstate them, even if it's only 24 hours later, than have Obamacare itself messed with in terms of trying to keep it. So you could write the 2 bills in parallel, so the repeal would in fact take place about the time we pass the new bill.
So you really don't believe you want to repeal Obamacare carte blanche?
No. I think there are pieces of Obamacare that many of us supported as pieces. I do want to repeal all of Obamacare in one single bill because I don't trust the legislative staffs. And I don't want to open up the bill. Having done that, there are some parts, almost all of you would agree we ought to keep, and those parts we ought to go back and repass as freestanding legislation, not as part of a 2,600-page bill.
And I would have to trust you to put all those things.
Well, you don't have to trust me, but I'd like you to.
Yes, in regards to foreign policy, you mentioned that our sovereignty comes from our Creator God. And as I listened to the President speak this afternoon, he spoke of democracy in the Middle East. Do you believe that a true democracy, as we understand it, is possible in a Muslim country?
Is it possible? Yes. Is it very difficult? Yes. And it depends again on the nature of a particular branch of Islam that is engaged. I am very disturbed that in Iraq, the number of Christians has dropped from 1,200,000 to 500,000. I'm very disturbed that as the Muslim Brotherhood is gaining strength in Egypt, they're starting to burn Coptic churches. I mean, Coptic churches have been there for 2,000 years. And so I think there's a real, in my mind, there's a real question whether this is an Arab Spring or whether, in fact, there are very real dangers built into this. And I think we should be, in fact, looking much deeper at the cultural changes needed to sustain a free society. I mean, democracy, if all it does is create a new tyranny, is not progress. And I think that the President is very naive in his approach to this thing. I'm told I have time for one last question, so it's up to this man.
Mr. Speaker, our Senator Grassley has recently endorsed the Keystone Pipeline and asked President Obama to do so also. That would bring Canadian crude into this country and help alleviate some of the gas shortage. How do you feel about that?
I favor the Keystone Pipeline. I think that, first of all, I'd like to have most of our energy made in the United States, but if it's not going to be here, I want it to be either Canada or Mexico, but not the Middle East. And given the current leader of Venezuela, not Venezuela. And we do produce a lot. The other part about, I was in Houston recently, the other thing about the Keystone Pipeline is it would also bring natural gas down to Houston to be liquefied, to then be shipped to China. And I like the idea of us selling stuff to the Chinese. And I think one of my goals would be to balance the budget and start buying back that $3 trillion of U.S. debt, because I don't feel at all comfortable. I don't want China to be my banker, because I don't want them to have that level of power in the United States. Well, I'm going to say, this is obviously the beginning of a long process. Many of you are experts at it. I know in a number of cases I've not met you yet for 11 times, so I don't fully expect a commitment. But I'd love to ask you to help me. The best thing you can do is go to newt.org and have your friends go to newt.org. I think this is the most consequential election in our lifetime, and maybe the most consequential election since 1860. I think 4 more years of the current president will be a genuine disaster for the future of this country. And I think we've got to find and put together a campaign that enables us to win. So I'm very grateful you came out this afternoon. I really, really would appreciate your help. I look forward to either getting pictures or